Kalorama, a recorded books Highbridge imprint, presents The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism, by Joe Conason. Read by Steve Marvel. Forward. It's a big part of the story, an essential one. If you're wondering how it came about that one of the two major political parties in the United States of America, the once grand old party, the party of Lincoln, now stands ready to nominate as its presidential candidate a soulless, conscienceless, quadruply indicted, twice impeached, pathologically lying con man, not to mention an adjudicated rapist, who tried to overthrow American democracy once, has proposed terminating the Constitution, and today openly promises that, if elected, he'd use the powers of the presidency to jail his opponents and to quash a free press, then this book is for you. To be sure, there are many threads to the sorry tale, and long after we know how it ends, and long after we are gone, historians, political scientists, and psychologists will still be pulling all of them. Teachers will teach them. Students will study them. Cultural and demographic change, economic discontent, racism, xenophobia, authoritarianism, narcissism, disinformation, foreign influence from malign state actors, technology, so many angles may be found from which to view our nation's current kaleidoscope of political dysfunction. But there's one engine that helped drive all of these factors to the fore, one force that pulls them together, one element that illuminates how so many people who knew better became, and remain, complicit in spreading these cancers on the body politic. And that's grift. Profit. As Joe Conason so ably and relentlessly describes in this book, the story of Trumpism, the decay of conservatism, is in no small part a story of money in politics. But not the story that's normally told, of moneyed interests paying off politicians with campaign contributions, or even straight-out graft, for tax or regulatory breaks or government contracts. That's out there, to be sure, and Joe touches upon some of it. What this book is really about is hucksterism on an ever-expanding scale. It turns out that lies sell, anger sells, hatred sells, conspiracy theories, libels, imaginary enemies, they all can be manufactured at minimal cost and marketed from coast to coast at a handsome markup to the masses, including many people who probably can't afford the price. You don't even have to be that smart or skilled to get into the business. What economists call barriers to entry are low. Anyone can play the game if they're shameless and greedy and dishonest enough. As Joe explains, it didn't start with Donald Trump. There's a remarkable through-line to the story, recounted skillfully in this book. Remember Roy Cohn, the lawyer whom Trump has idolized and lionized as a model of ferocious advocacy? Turns out Cohn and a special friend led the high life, gallivanting around Europe, sleeping in while keeping intimidated American diplomats waiting, all on the government dime on a hunt for communists on a list, Senator Joe McCarthy's, that didn't really exist. Cohn was the master, Trump later the apprentice. Now Trump is the master, for the moment. But there were so many other bad actors along the way, and so many more in the pipeline, people who discovered and monetized the fact that the rubes who send money to people who peddle lies do so over and over again. Those lists, mailing lists, were real, and they were worth fighting over, stealing, and litigating about. At first they were lists of names and street addresses. Now they're electronic addresses, with extensive data describing which pitches work for which donors to boot. Hey, do you want to help President Trump build the border wall he said Mexico would pay for? Enter your MasterCard number here and send your hard-earned money to me, Steve Bannon, at WeBuildTheWall.com. Don't like the election result? Well, that's because it was stolen. You can help by sending me, billionaire Donald Trump, money to bring lawsuits against everyone everywhere. Is something else upsetting you? We've already checked the recurring donation box for you. And let's not forget, Joe's book doesn't, the preachers for profit who market salvation along with self-enrichment, of course, in much the same way to many of the same people. Want the Lord on your side? Tithe to my church so I can buy me that Mercedes-Benz. We needn't bother him. Oh, and let us all pray for Donald Trump, man of God. So it didn't start with the orange Jesus, and no doubt it won't end with him either. We see the metastasis of the disease today in Congress, where a Republican majority in the House is controlled by members who care not a whit about policy or legislating in the public interest, but who serve only themselves by sticking to a reliable and endemic formula. Get on Fox News or Newsmax, say something outrageous and untrue, then have someone, on the payroll, send out the blast email solicitation. Collect cash. Rinse, repeat. No wonder the Republican Speaker of the House worried that it might be imprudent to expel George Santos, whose crimes amounted merely to carrying out, to its logical conclusion, what others have been doing all along. Never did I think I, a charter member, if I may say so myself, of Hillary Clinton's vast right-wing conspiracy, would write a foreword to a book by Joe Conason, praising him and his work. I was once a subject of his sharp words. But here we are. You can believe, in good faith, that the public interest is served by this policy or that, by more government or less. But if you believe that there is a public interest, and that public servants should serve that interest, and that facing raw truths is essential to that end, then you should care and learn about the toxic industry of mendacity that Joe so unsparingly describes here. George T. Conway III. Introduction. The most appropriate way to introduce the longest con is by paying homage where it is owed. The inspiration for this book's title, and much of what you will find in its chapters, was a magazine article written more than a decade ago by Rick Perlstein, the historian of modern conservatism, whose skill, integrity, and commitment have been widely celebrated across our nation's political divide. The Long Con appeared in the November 2012 issue of The Baffler, a bi-monthly journal of culture and politics that melds a left-leaning perspective with a surly temperament and a deft style. Published on the eve of a national election that pitted President Barack Obama against former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, Perlstein's essay amusingly dissected the Republican nominee's prevarications as an object lesson in right-wing chicanery. But then, as any serious historian is called to do, he delved far deeper. Peering through the scrim of Romney's falsehoods and beyond his deceptive campaign, Perlstein described a highly developed, very profitable system that marketed lies in many forms to millions of gullible American conservatives, and had mined that vein for a long time. He recalled subscribing some years earlier to several right-wing periodicals online, a decision that soon filled his email inbox to overflowing with fervent pitches for miracle cures, get-rich-quick investments, and assorted additional examples of important information from what an earlier generation would have called snake oil salesmen. Their messages promised to cure heart disease, reverse arthritis, end diabetes, ensure a secure retirement, provide thousands of dollars a month for little or no effort, and more, all endorsed by the trusted celebrities and outlets whose pronouncements are conservative gospel. Meanwhile, a kindred horde of entrepreneurs had built dozens of political action and issue-oriented committees raising millions of dollars that would supposedly result in an end to abortion, a shutdown of the United Nations, a clampdown on labor unions, and an apocalyptic rout of liberals everywhere. What they didn't mention, at least not in any legible typeface, was that only tiny fractions of the funds donated would be deployed for any campaign, cause, or candidacy. In fact, the proceeds were almost entirely destined for overhead or prospecting, which meant in practice that nearly all the remainder swelled the accounts of those who had solicited the money. It was not a coincidence, in Perlstein's view, that direct mail and online swindlers overlapped so heavily with right-wing con artists and often were identical with them. To an expert who has devoted his professional life to exploring and exposing modern conservatism, those motley scams suddenly seemed less a comic distraction than a central feature. Partisan chroniclers who look away from such lowbrow phenomena in recounting conservatism's heroic narratives are hiding from a fundamental truth. His verdict was unequivocal in warning that this stuff is as important to understanding the conservative ascendancy as are the internecine organizational and ideological struggles that make up its official history, if not indeed more so. The strategic alliance of snake oil vendors and conservative true believers points up evidence of another successful long march, of tactics designed to corral fleeceable multitudes all in one place, and the formation of a cast of mind that makes it hard for either them or us to discern where the ideological con ended and the money con began. That harsh judgment has been confirmed repeatedly since the rise of Donald Trump and the unabashed grifting that he embodies. But the evidence, which could fill the pages of many books, was piling up and spilling over well before Trump even showed up. As the author of Before the Storm, the definitive history of Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, Pearlstein detected the infrastructural roots of the grift in that movement. He was not wrong, as this book's retracing and elaboration of those connections will show. Nor was he wrong about Romney, although the retiring senator from Utah has improved his image considerably since that ill-fated presidential race. With Trump as the new paradigm, however, there was a powerful reason to trace the story back still further, to the days when Roy Cohn made his scandalous national debut as an assistant to Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. The brazen young attorney, who would become Trump's mentor in mendacity, demonstrated how a conspiracy theory could be used not only to advance a far-right agenda, but to glom unearned benefits for himself and a male companion. The premise of Cohn's ripoff, recalled in Chapter 1, was a bogus threat to national security from supposedly leftish books in United States Information Service libraries across post-war Europe. Vowing to stamp out this alleged literary subversion, he and his strapping pal David Shine indulged themselves in a tour of five-star hotels from London and Paris to Rome and Berlin. Compared with the multi-million-dollar depredations of Trump and his ilk, that junket now looks quaint and faintly comical, but it was a ruthless exercise in self-promotion that harmed the reputations of innocent individuals and damaged American prestige overseas. Subsequent chapters outline the template for right-wing grift that followed in McCarthy's wake, when various charlatans prospered by exploiting amplified anxiety over the Red Menace among middle-class Americans. While some overlaid the message with fundamentalist religion and others emphasized partisan political themes, all of them aimed to trigger irrational fear and popularize the myth of an impending communist takeover. By creating such an atmosphere of utter dread, and then promising that they alone could prevent America's doom, they induced thousands of suckers to hand over large wads of cash. Their mercenary antics and vacuous lectures enraged FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had his own racket to protect. Even Hoover understood that insofar as communism posed a challenge to the West, those con men had no idea how to oppose it and could only discredit its adversaries. Out of that environment of delusion and paranoia emerged the Goldwater movement and its leaders, and with them came direct mail dynamo Richard Viguerie, who had served as an early fundraiser for Billy James Hargis and his Christian Crusade. The commercial and political success of Viguerie's enterprises stimulated scores of imitators as the grift metastasized continuously into different forms: the New Right, the Moral Majority, the Tea Party movement, the Prosperity Gospel Church, and today Trump's MAGA movement, which encompasses a whole series of subsidiary swindles and scams, though none as potent as those overseen by Trump and his family. What remained consistent in each succeeding variation was the reliance on exaggeration, deception, and fabrication frequently permeated with racial apprehension and hostility, as well as a remorseless drive to squeeze every penny from the dupes. None of this appeared suddenly in 2015, and its impresarios had profited exorbitantly for a very long time. Indeed, literature tells us that grifting was an abiding feature of human society for centuries before the advent of modern politics. The history of cons, scams, and rackets in America dates back to the dawn of the Republic, and no doubt earlier. Frauds of every flavor have proliferated over the past century or more, growing in scope, complexity, and damage. More than once, those cons have inflicted terrible consequences, whether in the financial crash of 2008 or in the anti-vaccine uproar that left so many unnecessary dead from the COVID pandemic. There may or may not be something inherent in right-wing ideology that encourages dishonesty. Conservative philosophy demands civic virtue and moral rigor, and yet Americans who call themselves conservative are undeniably more susceptible to the multiplying varieties of politically tinged fakery, from phony charities and direct mail boondoggles to cancer and COVID cures, watered penny stocks, overpriced gold, and useless dietary supplements. While such con artists have come to play a dominant role among the right, where rejection of government and science leave the gullible unprotected, it is only fair to acknowledge there are and always were crooks identified with the left. The most notorious example in recent years was the national leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement, whose sincere donors were dismayed to learn of the gross mismanagement of nearly $100 million since 2020, with vast sums squandered on luxury real estate, big payouts to the relatives of its officials, first-class travel, and other insider abuses. A more complicated case is Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., the most prominent voice of the anti-vax movement, with all its attendant sleaze and profiteering from human misery. Kennedy has always represented himself as a man of the left, trading on his family's illustrious liberalism, despite his now extensive and evidently warm connections with the extreme right, both in the United States and Europe. His rhetoric and name also drew in a cohort of disgruntled liberals and may well continue to attract them, along with many millions of dollars. Charlatans can work both sides of the aisle. Still, there are fundamental distinctions in outlook between left and right that make one side more vulnerable than the other. It doesn't seem accidental that the principal Democratic campaign fundraising website, Act Blue, is a non-profit organization that only takes money for credit card fees and operating costs, while Win Red, the main Republican fundraising site, is run for private profit, and announced in 2023 that it will be raising prices during the next presidential cycle. There have been a few scammy political action committees on the Democratic side, but there have been dozens that fleeced Republicans. If your ideology dictates that profit is the highest aspiration, you will probably try to wring surplus value from everything and everyone, and your moral character may well deteriorate in that process. I will confess that my own political orientation has led me to grimace, and sometimes laugh, while writing this book. But it isn't only liberals like Pearlstein and me who have noticed rampant swindling on the right. Prominent conservatives have issued the most damning indictments, a budding genre of essays that bemoan grifting as a spreading stain on their movement. In National Review, Jim Garrity has written scathing, heavily documented columns about the abusive practices of right-wing scam packs and kindred outfits. His colleague Kevin Williamson has denounced the steady stream of surprisingly lucrative grifts of diverse and sundry kinds in those pages. The same complaint has been voiced by Jonah Goldberg, Rod Dreher, Matt Lewis, and Eric Erickson, among many others. The tone of those condemnations is often anguished and even bitter, particularly among those who have observed the sharp uptick of politicized larceny under Trump. When Garrity first broached the subject in 2019, he wrote, I'm just sick and tired of so many of our brethren averting their eyes from the big, glaring, worsening problem that rips off so many decent, hard-working folks. Erickson, a gun-loving religious rightist and hardliner who rejected Trump in 2016, has often called out what he sees as grifting on both sides. He publicly quit the corrupt NRA and repeatedly trashed his movement for betraying its donors. In September 2023, he returned to the troubling topic that had preoccupied him for years, and nothing had changed for the better. I've seen senior members of the conservative movement decide it was time to cash in and grift out, Erickson told his podcast listeners. I've seen young hucksters wrap the label of conservatism around themselves and prey on retirees for cash, showing fabricated results in return. I'm so old, I remember when CPAC was a gathering of actual conservatives and not a grift operation with a gay cruising scene on the side, referring acidly to a sexual harassment scandal that embroiled Matt Schlapp, the Conservative Political Action Conference chairman. Does Erickson sound angry? For honest conservatives, that sense of disappointment and cynicism, tinged by fury, is now a routine state of being with no prospect of relief. In the following, we examine how American conservatism sank to such a degraded condition, and why that should matter to all of us. 1. The Role Model. On a Saturday morning in April 1953, a mismatched pair of political hustlers descended from an American military transport aircraft onto the tarmac of Orly Airport just south of Paris. They wore expensive suits and carried fancy luggage. An observer glancing in their direction might first notice David Schein, tall, handsome, and endowed with the smiling confidence of status and wealth. But his shorter companion, a dark figure with a pugnacious expression and a distinctive scar on the bridge of his nose, was in command of this expedition. He was Roy Marcus Cohn, counsel to Senator Joseph R. McCarthy's Communist Hunting Subcommittee back in Washington, D.C. Both men were in their mid-20s, but it was Roy Cohn who had already helped send the convicted Soviet spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to the electric chair. A newly admitted lawyer, he had won the merciless decree through a series of secret and highly unethical conclaves with the sentencing judge. Impressed by that grisly achievement, McCarthy had recruited Cohn only a few months earlier to assist him in cleansing the United States government of subversion of all kinds, from left-wing sympathizers to suspected homosexuals. Not long after he was hired, Cohn had persuaded McCarthy to employ Schein. They had been introduced at a nightclub in New York by George Sokolsky, the right-wing Hearst newspaper columnist. Cohn presented the rich but intellectually underdeveloped Schein to his new boss as an expert on communism, which was a gross deception. Schein's father, a hotel magnate, had somehow gotten him into Harvard University, much as real estate mogul Charles Kushner would do for his son Jared decades later. But when Schein arrived at Harvard Yard, he had immediately hired a secretary to attend his classes, which he too often failed anyway, while he swanned around town in a chauffeured black limousine. Evidently, he didn't learn much. The sole evidence supporting Schein's expertise on the Red Menace was a 6-page pamphlet titled Definition of Communism that he was said to have written for distribution in the family hotels, where it was placed in every room alongside the Gideon Bible. Even a glance at this brief opus betrayed his comical ignorance, for Schein had gotten the dates of the Russian Revolution and the founding of the Communist Party wrong, while badly confusing the identities of Stalin, Trotsky, Lenin, and Marx. The whip-smart Cohn, a graduate of Columbia University and law school, surely knew the Schein pamphlet was garbage, if he ever actually looked at it. How little Cohn or Schein cared about their ostensible mission was exposed years later by the anti-communist author Frida Utley, who dismissed him and Schein as unscrupulous careerists. As a McCarthy advisor and confidant, she had prepared his would-be investigators with a list of important anti-communist books that were missing from the shelves of United States Information Service, USIS, libraries. But as the outraged Utley later recounted, the careless duo had misconstrued her list as a compilation of pro-communist books. Their fact-finding mission was merely a cynical boondoggle. McCarthy's callow emissaries plainly understood that public service could present outstanding opportunities for what we would now recognize as scamming, and they took full advantage. Shortly after he and Shine landed in Paris, Cohn issued a peremptory command to U.S. Information Service personnel in the French capital that he expected to meet with them in their offices the next morning, which happened to be Easter Sunday, at 8 a.m. sharp. No doubt resentful of this imposition on the holiday, which they had expected to celebrate with their families, the loyal American civil servants nevertheless arrived on time, just as Cohn had demanded, but neither he nor Shine showed up. That introductory debacle was recounted in a 1991 oral history interview with Julia Child, who had studied cooking in France when her husband, Paul, was among the American diplomatic employees there. Cohn and Shine had arrived in Paris, and of course they went out to all the nightclubs and so forth, and it happened to be during Easter, and on Easter Sunday they had called a meeting that everyone was to go there at 8 o'clock a.m. at the USIS office, Child recalled acidly. Of course they didn't appear. It turned out when USIS officials finally got hold of them, they were sleeping off a night at Montmartre, the city's fabled cabaret district. This inauspicious debut in no way daunted Cohn, whose sense of entitlement was matched only by his duplicity. Several days later, in Frankfurt, he and Shine pulled an even more embarrassing stunt. Having ordered public affairs staffers of the High Commission for Occupied Germany to appear for another 8 a.m. meeting, they arrived 3 hours late. Before the meeting could even begin, Shine announced that he had put on the wrong trousers and dispatched a driver to their hotel to pick up the right ones. Then he realized that he had also left behind his notebook and returned to the hotel with Cohn to retrieve it. In the hotel lobby, according to a Frankfurt newspaper, Shine was observed batting Mr. Cohn over the head with a rolled-up magazine. Both men then disappeared into Shine's room for several minutes. Later, the hotel maids reportedly found ashes and cigarette butts strewn around the room, amid the overturned furniture. With all this peculiar behavior, it wasn't surprising that hints of a homoerotic relationship between Cohn and Shine soon proliferated in the press, even as the two tough guys mocked the supposedly limp-wristed diplomats they were investigating. The Washington columnist Drew Pearson reported deadpan that they seemed unusually preoccupied with investigating alleged homosexuals. The nasty whispers enraged Cohn, who would spend a lifetime attempting to conceal his own promiscuous homosexuality beneath a veneer of overbearing masculinity. With McCarthy's collaboration, he pioneered what would become a chronic syndrome on the American right, the political victimization of gays by closeted conservatives like himself. In the decades that followed, sexual hypocrisy became an indelible right-wing brand, from the moralizing politicians who hounded Bill Clinton while concealing their own adulterous affairs, to the conservative preachers and online activists who condemned homosexuality while molesting teenagers and even children. The more loudly they condemned pederasty, the more pedophiles seemed to pop up in their ranks. But Cohn had discovered the secret of diverting attention from his own conduct by stirring up paranoia and stoking hatred. He had learned that he and Shine could own the libs while enjoying a taxpayer-funded jaunt across Europe, and that with enough bluster they could escape any real consequences. Over the following weeks, Cohn and Shine brought their sinister vaudeville to Bonn, Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Belgrade, Athens, and Rome, then back to Paris, and finally to London, spending little more than a day in any city. They conducted perfunctory interviews with the Americans they purported to investigate, and then invariably hosted press conferences where they entertained reporters with arrogant and ill-informed denunciations of subversive literature in the USIS libraries. Following their appearance...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?